Welcome to Going for Two Live, presenting press coverage. I'm your host, Kyle Senra, and joining me for today's episode is Scott Connor. So, Scott, first off, welcome.
Kyle, it's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate you having me on the show. Put it together some interesting questions, and going to talk the whole gamut, some Dynasty, some fantasy, and some other stuff. So thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who don't know, Scott Connor, host of the Dynasty and Chill podcast, co-host of the Mannequin Chill podcast at Charles Chill FFB. So if you'll find out, he's a pretty chill guy, although his name's not Charles.
Listen, everyone always asks me why Charles Chill. That Charles is my middle name. I got that nickname when I was a kid. So basically I was always like Mr. Chill in high school and in junior high. So just nicknamed me Charles Chill, and it's just stuck for 25 years.
Alliterations are awesome. So that's why it works there. And it's funny because I had a friend his name is also Charles. It nothing to do with his actual name, not his middle name at all. So that I don't know, someone just called him Charles for whatever reason. So I'm used to that being a name that's not actually a name. So I'm skeptical of anyone whose name is Charles, actually.
Ooh, all right. Good to know. I'm on your show, so we'll see.
Yes. Certainly don't be skeptical of Scott's fantasy football knowledge. I've witnessed firsthand how he can dominate a league entirely. I think back to the Midwest Fantasy Football Expo a couple years ago, wearing that shirt in commemoration. And you completely wiped the floor with our league. So the famed 14 running back strategy and just take advantage of scoring settings, right? And I think that's what you always say first is roster and scoring settings.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really strategize properly for a league, even Dynasty. I mean, the values of every position, the way you're going to attack a draft ultimately comes down to the scoring, the settings, and the roster construction. I mean, everyone that knows my background will get into it. Very player agnostic, very much situational agnostic when it comes to the NFL. I really don't worry about that stuff till we get to the season. It's really just attacking a league based on the settings, the format, the rules, whatever parameters you can try to gain an advantage from. I mean, and I hate to say it, you get in a league, 12 teams, 3 or 4 people may not even understand the basics of the settings or the scoring. So it doesn't even really matter where they're getting their information from in terms of player info, player rankings, ADP. If they're not constructing their roster the right way, they're at a big disadvantage. So yeah, that's where you got to start.
Well, and we're going to start all the way back. So before even, we get into this advanced dynasty strategy, before even fantasy football, how did you first get into football in general?
Oh man. So I played football growing up and played into high school, but I'm 5'8" on a good day and 170 pounds. So, I mean, it's funny, when I was a kid, I actually played on the offensive line, and then everyone else hit a growth spurt and I didn't. So now all of a sudden I'm one of the smaller kids. So, I played, but I was done. I didn't have any aspirations of playing any further. I would have never made it. But I played fantasy football. Gosh, I played fantasy football. I think the first league I played in, I was maybe in 6th grade. So we're talking back early 90s, 94, 95. I mean, yeah, so way back. But back then fantasy was essentially 1% of what it is right now. I mean, there were a couple websites. The first league I can remember playing online was Yahoo, and it was probably like 1998, 1997-ish. And just kind of evolved from there. The more you start playing, you start getting into different formats. I remember doing any of the DFS players out there. I remember in college, I had my own little like daily fantasy league that we were in. And you remember the old salary cap leagues on like CBS Sportsline and those, where they had a salary cap, but it was almost like daily fantasy with the salary cap. We would run kind of like a mini like GPP tournament with 10 people, and everyone would stick to basically a salary. And that was all scored basically out of a magazine and a newspaper. I mean, it wasn't like live scoring like it is now. Like you actually had to write everything down and then add it up the next day when you got the box scores. But yeah, just fantasy evolves, and it evolves into more leagues and keeper leagues, and then finally Dynasty like 2014, 2015 range.
Yeah, I think that seems like that's a tipping point right now for a lot of people in the space. That 14, 15, the first time I joined like salary cap contract leagues, I remember distinctly 2015. So I kind of call that my jump into the advanced formats Dynasty. So it seems like that's just a, what do you think happened? Do you think, I know everyone talks about the 2014 rookie class, specifically the wide receiver class. Do you think that alone was enough to garner interest in Dynasty? And obviously you can talk about yourself, but we can talk about the general population. Specifically to you, what made you want to dive into Dynasty?
So from a football standpoint, I also grew up, and I did this a lot longer before I even started playing fantasy football. I used to play a lot of simulation games. So if anybody remembers like Out of the Park Baseball and Baseball Mogul and those types of games, Fast Break Basketball, kind of the same way they have Madden simulations now, but I used to play like PC simulations back in high school and in college. So in a way, there's an element of Dynasty in those because you're carrying your team from year to year, and that kind of just evolved into, there really wasn't anything for football because I think football is a little too complex to necessarily have that type of setup, like to run a full roster. For like baseball simulations, you can easily simulate a baseball team. You have somebody at every position, and then you also can have, some of those games had minor leagues that you can manage and stuff like that. But football, they just didn't have it in the space. At least Football Mogul is the only game I can remember that was a simulation game that you treated like Dynasty, where you had contracts and you had a draft and all that kind of stuff. So I really didn't know about it until some guys that I played in those leagues with, baseball and football specifically, they had baseball and basketball specifically, they had a football league. Got into basically like a simulation football league, and that paved the way to getting into a Dynasty league, which was right around 2014, 2015. So I had a background there, but I had no idea of any of the Dynasty principles that we talk about now. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about the difference between positional advantages and, I was taking quarterbacks early on in single quarterback leagues. I mean, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's how I got into it, mostly from the sim game and mostly from other sports.
Before the process.
Right. Exactly.
Shout out to one of the listeners, viewers, Alex, saying, hey guys, hey Alex, hey back. Thanks for tuning in. And of course, I'll be asking Scott a lot of questions. Anyone, of course, in the chat on the various platforms, feel free to ask away as well. So the eventual jump into Dynasty, and then came the podcast Dynasty and Chill. Was that your first foray into fantasy football creation, or content creation, or did you create and write in other places before?
No, so that was really my first experience with my own show or my own podcast. I joined the old Dynasty Command Center back in 2017. Ryan McDowell and Curtis Patrick started Dynasty Command Center. At the time, they were doing a show called the Player Rater podcast. If anyone remembers that, it was a DLF podcast, I believe. But they did a podcast together. I started listening to that. They launched this community called Dynasty Command Center. I joined. I just joined as, hey, I'm playing Dynasty now. I was in probably 8-10 leagues at that point. With moderate success, but I don't think there was any success that was due to my process, right? So I joined Dynasty Command Center basically just to learn more. And slowly, I had already been playing in enough leagues to kind of be able to chime in on the threads and talk about, strategy with this or that. And I had started playing Superflex at that point. So I had a few Superflex leagues as well. But just hung around there for like a year and was really active in the Slack chat and interacting with player questions, trade questions. And I think they, just liked my engagement and participation. And so they hired some staff members and they basically said, you want to come on board? It started as basically being a chat moderator, answering questions, start questions, trade questions. And then it got to the point where before they hired me, people would tag me and ask my opinion on stuff. And so they're finally like, yeah, you're really engaged. Let's bring you on as a staff member. So they bring me on as a staff member. That eventually transformed into a paid staff member. And then it transformed into doing projects like Dynasty Command Center started their rookie guide. They started a podcast. I guest spotted on the podcast every once in a while. And then RotoViz bought Dynasty Command Center. And basically, shout out to both, but Curtis Patrick and Ryan McDowell, they basically had a split. One went RotoViz side and then Ryan was at DLF. So, at that point, I had been on the staff for a while and I ended up joining DLF. So at that point, I started writing content, started producing content in a written form. And at the same time, 2017, 2016, I had actually joined Toastmasters to improve my public speaking. And so I had done that for like 2 years and I was very comfortable speaking in public forums. I had done a radio show here in Columbus, Ohio for a little while through a college radio station. We did a fantasy football show with somebody in my home league. So I was very comfortable. And I'm like, you know what? I know from being on these podcasts at DLF and at Dynasty Command Center that I kind of understand how a podcast works. It's just a matter of being able to set up the technical part, the editing, the recording, getting the right equipment. So I just jumped in. I said, you know what, I'll start my own podcast. And boom, I started it. It started as a solo show and it's evolved to now basically just a strategy and interview show. So yeah, just literally self-taught. Don't have a communications background or anything. Just have been in public speaking for 5 or 6 years and we're here today.
And there we go. And, the evolution of Dynasty and Chill, not just a podcast anymore. You set up a Patreon account. And I remember that happened, I guess it's like 2 years now. And I remember when you first announced it and you first talked about it, you were wondering about the engagement, and it seemed to just grow quickly. So, something I've talked about with quite a few guests on this show up to this point. I mean, 6 episodes in, so he's still a young show, but almost everyone talks about the sense of community in the fantasy football community. And I feel like the Dynasty and Chill chat, as Chill Billies, as I think J Mike referred, was the first to coin that, the first guest on this show. I feel like that's a real sense of community and a real look through into the Dynasty world right now.
It is. And I think the key, and again, this is just coming from somebody that's only been doing this for a couple years. But I was influenced. I remember a year ago before I launched the Patreon channel, it launched about a year ago. I had talked to Ray GQ, and we had just talked about some business strategy and stuff. And I'm like, I'm kind of seeking that next level. Because tons of people, when you start a podcast, and anyone that listened to the very early version of Dynasty and Chill, the first probably 20, 30 episodes was just me. It was a solo show. And it was me just kind of talking about what's on my brain. Some of it was good, some of it was bad, but I think it got an insight into my process. And I think that's why probably a lot of people started to listen and started to follow. But I got to a point where it was like, grinding out a solo show every single week. Not that it's not valuable, but I thought you could do more. I thought there could be more community involvement because I'm not going to evolve as a player if all I'm doing is reading Twitter and producing my own podcast. I don't have anybody there to check, to reach out to me and say, hey, let's talk about this. Maybe I see it a little bit differently. So it evolved into more of an interview show. And then it evolved into people reaching out to me and saying, hey, can you do this? Or can you talk about this? Direct messages. Can you do a show on this? Or can you do a show on that? So I kind of split it up and said, okay, I'll launch the Patreon channel as more of a direct access to me, and also direct access to me producing, very specific strategy content, very specific stuff that caters to probably people that are already joining, are probably playing Dynasty already in a certain way. So they're going to be more into the content that I'm talking about versus, somebody that's on the complete opposite spectrum. Nothing wrong with that, but there's probably a reason why they're seeking out more of that type of information. So that's morphed into more of just a very specific content stream, whereas the main show is now kind of just talking high-level strategy, interviewing other people that also, either share like-minded or the opposite strategy. I think there's a place for both. But yeah, it's just creating a brand, and I don't have any aspirations. I don't want a Patreon channel with 500 members. You know what I mean? I want to be able to have direct interaction with everybody. I want to be able to keep it manageable to where I can produce quality content that appeals to kind of a niche group. That's what it's about. It's never about becoming massive. You know what I mean? I have no aspirations of setting up a website, merchandise, anything like that. It's here for the specific process and the specific strategy. So yeah, I say that's kind of where we're at now. Who knows where the future is going to be? But yeah, just really kind of blessed and thankful for it to be where it is right now, because I would never have imagined it a year ago.
And I think just the quantity and quality of people in the Chillbillies organization crew, however we say it, is I think quite extraordinary. So I think it's a lot of good voices, a lot of constant nonstop messaging. Very rarely is there not someone mentioning something, sharing some tweet, and extrapolating some type of information, and it's fantastic. It's truly extraordinary. It's a little overwhelming, in fact. And I think a lot of this might be overwhelming. You talked about your, we'll say, process for getting into the creation and how that evolved. So now that you've given insight to your specific journey, what would you give as more of a general advice to someone who is starting out to try and create content of some sort?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I think that I'll say this. I think you have to do your research, obviously. I mean, you have to have information that isn't necessarily already out there by 50 other people. So you do have to do your research and be somewhat unique. But I think you can even simplify it. I think you just have to be convicted in a strategy, and be able to look back at your strategy and do a 180 a year later if it didn't work out. But I think conviction, one thing that we're noticing, and this kind of gets into a bigger discussion and we can decide to go down this road or not, but I think we're noticing one of the biggest differences I found in Dynasty from 2018 when I was at RotoViz and Dynasty Command Center versus now is the information that's out there is 20x what it was then. So there's so much information out there. It's hard. If you are on just Twitter and you have a phone that can play podcasts or a YouTube app that can find any sort of content on there, it's hard for you to miss certain things. There is so much content that you can hear the same thing 50 different places over a month period. So it's hard to kind of miss a lot of the basic principles of Dynasty. And the average player, I think, in turn, has gotten smarter over the last couple of years. And I don't want to say they've gotten smarter in terms of, they win more or it's harder to trade with them. But I think you always have to be looking for an angle to predict. We talk about in the Chillbillies a lot, just forecasting. If it's already happening in front of your eyes, it's too late because there's probably half the people in your league are already doing it. So you almost have to look ahead and say, okay, here's what I'm seeing right now. I think this is either going to go exponentially more in this direction or it's going to regress and it's going to flip the opposite way. But you almost have to forecast and then make a bet that you're going to be right. That's a way to separate yourself from the average player. Because I've found a lot of the strategies that used to work for me 3 or 4 years ago, they don't work now. And sometimes I'm playing against people that are maybe just afraid to do anything. You know what I mean? They don't take a convicted stance. They kind of just sit back and wait for me to act first, and then they're going to decide how they're going to respond. But on the other hand, they may have a very similar process to me. It's interesting. We get in a league where there's, I always joke, the worst league for me would be a league where there's 11 other people in our Patreon channel. Because it's like, I now have to come up with a brand new strategy that might be completely contrarian to everything that I would basically do in the first place. Because I know there's 11 other people that are doing the same thing, or 80% of it, right? So I think Dynasty players are smarter now. You have to always be basically acting a year ahead. And if you lose, it's not the worst thing in the world if you lose big, right? If you lose big and you completely flop and you end up at the very top of the draft the next year, that's not the worst thing in the world. So I think it's just constantly finding ways to forecast and stay ahead. I think that's the biggest challenge of being a content creator, but also being a Dynasty player.
And it's funny that the looking ahead, predicting, forecasting applies to both as fantasy football strategy, but also content trying to,
Absolutely.
I mean, 3 years ago, who knew about TikTok, right? Or maybe 5 years ago, that shows how little I knew, but just as an example. And if you could forecast something like that, or if as it came on, got onto it quick and really make, anchor into a niche format as it grows bigger, you grow as well. So that, trying to find the new big thing and hook onto it. And I think we've seen that maybe even just this year, that just, the Clubhouse and even the Top Shot, right? All these new things that people are like fantasy wise are really gathering towards, and they're, everyone's quickly gathering to new sites. It seems like there's so many people that anytime some new format or some new potential comes up, everyone gravitates towards it immediately, which is it's kind of forcing the competition. You have to adapt, evolve to keep up.
Yeah, I think one of the, and I don't even know if I necessarily have a plan to do this, but I've kind of already started it with the content that we have on the Patreon channel. I mean, I think one of the biggest places to grow is being able to give direct, actionable advice without actually telling somebody what to do. Truthfully, it's almost like teaching somebody how to fish and not telling them how to necessarily get the fish for them. You know what I mean? The whole the idea of teaching somebody the process, but also understanding where your process may mean different players or a different trade for another person. But it's direct interaction without basically saying, okay, which player do you prefer, player A or player B? And a lot of times my answer is I don't really care. It's a process answer of why. If you disagree with the answer, that's okay. Just understand why I was thinking the way that I was thinking. So when it comes down to, and we'll get into that more when we talk, but I think there's a space for, and I haven't even perfected it either, because I find myself spending a lot of one-on-one time with people answering their questions. But I also know that's probably a losing proposition. I can only get so big as, in terms of being a content creator. I only have so many hours a day, only so many hours a week. I can't support 100 different people that want me to do a breakdown of their podcast. I don't have enough hours. So how do you streamline that and create direct access and be able to give some direct answers without just giving the answer? So I don't know. It's a work in progress for me, but I do think that there's a future of not just putting out content, but being able to directly interact with somebody, kind of like Clubhouse. Clubhouse is cool because you can jump on there, you can ask questions, and it's a much quicker back and forth than it would be if you have to type the question out and respond on a tweet. Or if you take questions for a podcast, then you have to go and record it, edit it, release it, distribute it. Somebody has to download it. Somebody has to then listen to it. Mm-hmm. Total time, that's 3 or 4 hours. Clubhouse, you can do all the same thing in 15, 20 minutes. So I think that modality is maybe the next wave of what content creation could be.
Talk about the instant data gathering and instant information that's also to the fantasy content is also that expectation. So Alex, who commented earlier, also has a comment thanking you, Scott in particular, saying, Scott helped me see the difference between name value and points actually being produced. I think this gets into the process, which I think might be a good transition point. Now I look for opportunities to pivot from big names to a similar producer plus a draft pick or extra player. I feel like that's almost what you call the process in general. This isn't what the 76ers did, of course, but do you have any comments to say to Alex at that?
Yeah, I mean, shout out to Alex. I think what he's referring to, it started a couple years ago. And I wasn't the first person to come up with this, but you can even search the hashtag, the wide receivers don't matter. I've been hitting that hashtag for a couple years, and it started with receivers, but you're starting to see it everywhere in Dynasty. But the easiest examples are at receivers. I mean, you can just pull up an ADP list. This is the exercise everyone that's listening can go out and pull up an ADP list and just kind of visualize when you read down the line. You just go player to player to player down the list. Just do the top 24 or top 36 and just ask yourself, if you had an invisible wand that was kind of pointing towards what is making up that player's value, how much of it is, okay, they've been the best player in fantasy at their position they've been a top 3 player at their position or a top 5 player or whatever. Or on the other hand, they really haven't done anything from a fantasy standpoint, but their value's made up of, well, they had a great profile, or they're very, very highly thought of in this community or that community, whether it's film or analytics or just the general Twitter Dynasty community. So just kind of, it's like an invisible gauge of what makes up a player's value. And then better understanding, well, why are those gauges where they are? And the easiest example is just wide receivers. I mean, we've talked about tons of times on the regular show and on the Patreon show that there is a really flat tier of receivers in the NFL right now. It's just growing every year. I mean, at what point does the bubble burst where we can't just throw in another 15 receivers in the first 3 rounds of every single draft and just assume they're all going to be wide receiver 3s. And it's interesting. You look at like the receiver landscape, there's a lot of guys that haven't even hit 30 yet. So at some point it has to burst. But in that meantime, until people figure out the burst, and then you factor in the settings in your league, how many starters, how deep does it go? That kind of gives you the idea of where the burst point is. It's very easy to take a player and say, okay, I'll throw out a guy like T. Higgins. I'm a Bengals fan. I love T. Higgins, but right now he's wide receiver 12 in the ADP. And, it may not be able to be done now because there's a chance that they take Jamar Chase, which I think people will be a little scared to pay the sticker price for T. Higgins. But just finding these receivers that they're great. Don't get me wrong. They're great. They're up there for a reason. Justin Jefferson is the wide receiver top 3 for a reason. But can you extract value out of Justin Jefferson and get very similar production and still get a similar profile, right? You go from Justin Jefferson to DJ Moore. You're not getting that difference of a profile. Not that big a difference. All you're doing is basically taking advantage of the recency bias from last year. And yeah, you maybe lose a year or two. But if you just look at it from a bet perspective, you can almost hit that flat tier of receivers and just say none of them are more than like 70% bets to deliver what their current value is. And most of them are at least 30% to over deliver what their value is right now. So you're just making bets within that range, and you can do that at any position. So that's basically how I've made my way in Dynasty. And as a result, I just keep adding more leagues and going, okay, I'm just going to do it over and over and over and diversify where I do it, different formats, different leagues. And that's essentially what I built my brand on.
And you've turned really this hobby into quite almost basically a full-time job in terms of investments and time. And so we'll scale back a little bit on the fantasy and just outside of fantasy and football. What are your favorite hobbies, Scott?
What are my favorite hobbies? So as you can see in my background, I'm recording this lovely episode from my garage. I'm a fitness buff. I used to be a power lifter. That was in my 20s until I basically crushed my nervous system. So shout out to all the fantasy football fit taglines out there. I love it. I love the idea of, doing anything that makes you healthier in terms of fitness. But anybody that knows me or that's listened to me talk before, like I can be very much OCD when it comes to things. I'm very much a type A personality, and that got me in powerlifting. I definitely took it to the extreme, and I was training at a level that was not sustainable for my nervous system. So, that beat me up pretty good. So I'm kind of a retired power lifter at this point. I've probably dropped like 30 pounds since then, mostly just losing my strength and muscle over the time. But yeah, that's still a huge hobby of me. Actually, before Dynasty, I was very much into studying nutrition and biochemistry, and I have very much a math and a science background. So I'm still, very particular about my diet and nutrition and health habits and sleep habits and stuff like that. So that's one of my passions. And then I'd say the other one would be probably one thing a lot of people know about me just from the Patreon chat is I have a lot of cats. I actually have 5 cats. So I'm kind of like a second home for a lot of cats. I work for a local cat shelter, volunteer there. My wife and I foster cats, in and out. We usually have a different foster cat coming in every couple months. Really love family of cats. Have no kids, so it makes it easier.
You've got the time for all these cats meow.
Yep.
All right. So, and you said those might be things people know about you. Are you willing to share anything that the fantasy community doesn't know about you?
Doesn't know about me. Well, I'll share this. This is kind of a personal story, but it kind of does define probably very much why I am the way I am right now. So I was a kid, 15 actually. I was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, which, you can look up the difference between type 1 and type 2. But basically, a type 1 diabetic means your pancreas, it's not working. It doesn't make insulin. It doesn't pump insulin. And I was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic at 15. And I actually was under the care of a doctor and treated for type 1 diabetes for 6 years. Did 3 insulin injections a day, monitored my blood sugar 5-6 times a day. And all of a sudden, just cold turkey, when I was in college, I forgot my insulin on a vacation. So we panicked, but I went like a day or two without it. And I felt fine. I felt different. I didn't feel like, what you would typically get if you had really, really low blood sugar or really high blood sugar. I didn't feel that way. So I just kind of said, I'm going to keep it going for a couple more days. And basically I didn't do anything for like 2 weeks. Went back to my doctor and they finally confirmed after a bunch of testing and a bunch of doctor's appointments, they said, you never had it. And, that kind of fueled my fire to really get into lifestyle changes, because I had some issues. I definitely had some health issues. I was a type 2 diabetic, which basically means it's lifestyle. My diet, my exercise, my nutrition was what was causing the symptoms. But I wasn't a type 1 diabetic, which, when you're a type 1 diabetic as a kid, not that you can't live with it, but there's a lot of risk that it comes later on in life. If you're a type 1 diabetic for 50 years and you're on insulin and you're, doing a bunch of other stuff, I was very relieved. So that's kind of fueled my fire to be very meticulous about what I eat, my fitness, my sleep, my stress. I mean, I really try to keep that stuff in track and checked out because of that, I guess, fear that it could get back to where it was when I was a kid.
And speaking of being meticulous, we're about a half hour in, so we'll drop this here. And it is almost NFL draft season. I mean, we're past free agency right now. Trevor Lawrence looks like it's going to be the first overall pick. He's got those luscious locks, some would say, that flowing hair. Now, if you've got Trevor Lawrence hair in your pants, maybe not a good idea. That's why Manscaped is such a great investment to make. They're the leaders in below the waist grooming, and they've partnered with us here at Going for Two Live to help you get great value on their great products. And so, using the promo code PRESS for this show, as in press coverage, capital PRESS, all caps. Get 20% off if you use the code PRESS when you make your order at Manscaped. So again, 20% off using the promo code PRESS. And don't be a cheapskate. Use Manscaped when it comes to your manhood. I think I said that last part wrong, but yeah. New partnership here at Going for Two. So we'll be pushing it on basically all the live shows as it's getting into the fantasy community. A question from Alex, and asking you, Scott, what's your favorite format? So we'll sneak back into fantasy here. I think Dynasty is the clear thing, but specific in Dynasty type of settings.
Man, that is tough because I think I pretty much play in every format you can think of. I would say, so I'll put it this way. If I was going to start a league today, and it was like pick your optimal settings, optimal scoring, optimal roster setup, I would probably say, and I haven't really thought about this yet. I kind of want to get your take on it, Kyle. With the new 17-game schedule, it used to be before, if you like symmetry, a 14-team league is great because it basically meant you played everybody once during the season. But now with the 17-game schedule, it's probably going to kick our fantasy schedule to 14 games, which means it's going to throw off, the symmetry of your league. So I would say 14 because 14 team, you have to start obviously super flex. If you want to get real interesting, you can play 2QB. I think 2QB really, really challenges people to read the settings and understand how valuable quarterbacks are. Even if it's only a 12 team, if you don't have them, you're going to pay a lot more than probably you want to get them. But I'd say 14 team, let's keep it super flex. I want to see slightly inflated quarterback scoring. So I think it bumps it up just a little bit. But then I'd also want to see deep starting lineups. So I like having some roster scarcity. So I'm not a huge fan anymore of the leagues where it's just a bunch of flexes, only because I think it kind of kills the scarcity of the other positions. So I'd say 14 teams, super flex, slightly inflated quarterback scoring, 2 running backs, 3 receivers. I like 2 tight end as well. I think if you put 2 tight end with a slight premium, maybe 1.5 or 1.75, it brings hyper value into that too, where people actually have to draft them probably earlier than they should. And it's a little risky when you're drafting tight ends. And then probably at least 12 starters. So we'll call it 14 by 12 with 2 tight ends, super flex, slightly inflated quarterback scoring, 5 to be specific, and just PPR. I mean, we can get into points per carry and, getting into some different, tiered PPR settings as well. But I think that that basic parameter, I think, is pretty good.
Yeah, so I hope that was specific, Alex. As to your question, Scott, about the week 17 games per team now, part of me has wondered, do we almost, because there is the talk of how this is going to work. Are there going to be 2 bye weeks for players but not teams? And like, are players going to randomly sit out a game? Are we going to know in advance? So I think there's a lot that we still don't know yet. And maybe it's be convicted and make a decision before we know. But when it comes to setting up the league, I think this is maybe something to wait on. I think once the NFL schedule is actually released, that'll be a lot more. That'll provide clarity, at least, of what we should expect. And then maybe they'll announce, like, what are they doing? Are the players actually playing all 17 games themselves? Is that going to be part of the contract? Is that the new CBA? Does that eliminate that worry of the second bye week? So I think I'm just asking more questions than answering. I'm sorry.
No, obviously, until we see the schedule, we're not going to know exactly how it's going to work. My understanding is it's just going to be an extra game. It's going to take place in place of one of the preseason games. There's not going to be an extra bye week. Now, I think your question's geared more towards, we're setting it up from a fantasy standpoint. I don't think anything from the NFL is going to change. It's going to be 17 games in 18 weeks instead of 16 games in 17 weeks. For fantasy, we don't know how teams are going to treat this at the end of the year. They may give a player an extra game off at some point. We may see more players opt to sit a game when they're not 100% for this same reason. If you have a bye week 4 and you add an extra game onto the end of the season, and then you're going to get into the playoffs, that you may have teams playing 14, 15, 16 straight weeks if you have an early bye week. So that'll be interesting to see how the NFL sets up the bye weeks. What I hope is that they spread out the bye weeks a little bit more. If you have an extra week, there is no reason to have 6 teams on a bye in 1 week. That seems a little bit overkill. But you could have, I wouldn't have hated it if they would have made it so that there's 8 teams on bye weeks, but you get 2 bye weeks. Right? And just take an extra week for the season. I would have liked to see that from a player's perspective. But from a fantasy perspective, now we're talking about, because we don't care about the back 3 or 4 weeks of the NFL season in terms of, like, we don't care about week 17 or what's going to be the new week 18. We don't care about the NFL playoffs for our dynasty leagues either. But these players and the teams are looking at that going, man, if I'm going to make the playoffs, I need my guys available for that extra 3 or 4 games potentially. So, does the second bye week maybe make the performances for the players during the season a little bit better? I don't know. But yeah, I don't think it's going to change much. I think they're just going to throw an extra game at the players and say, your $8 million contract is now spread over 17 games instead of 16. Deal with it if you want the full amount. You know what I mean? So,
and part of my thinking is, why do we even need to change that much? Like you're saying, if you're in a 14-team league and you like the synchronicity of a 13-game schedule, instead of just not playing week 17, just decide I'm not going to play week 17, week 18. 16 weeks is it. We enjoy this, but it is quite a grind already. So I don't know that it's, if the league wants to and everyone's for it, sure, but I don't think we absolutely have to add that extra week to the fantasy schedule just because the NFL is either. I think. And again, that's league to league variance, and commissioners and league members decide that. But I also think, maybe that not to overreact either sometimes.
No, I think that's, and we're in a couple leagues too. That might be something we have to bring up and say, hey, like, what does everyone want to do? Do we want to, the easiest solution is literally just to push the fantasy playoffs out 1 week, have an extra regular season week. And now it's 14 games instead of the typical 13. We're talking a standard league where, there's 3 rounds of the playoffs. But you could also get creative. I've talked to some of my co-commissions and we've talked about, can we make some interesting settings to where maybe you have a 2-week qualifying, like, wild card round where you still reward the top couple teams with a bye and they automatically get into the semifinals. But then, let's say you have 5 teams that are going to get in, you give 2 a bye and you let the other 3 play over 2-week period and see who gets into the semifinals or something like that. It kind of makes it, I think you have to weigh 2 things. Do you want to reward the teams that get into the playoffs with more variance, or do you want to reward the teams during the regular season that maybe have a stronger team with a little more opportunity to show their strength, right? Like, because if I have a really good team, I want a longer regular season because my team is probably going to be able to absorb more injuries, more bad luck, more bad matchups in a head-to-head game. So if I have a good team, if I'm sitting on a good team, I'm going to vote, hey, let's expand the regular season an extra week. Why not? That's going to help me. That's going to hurt you if you have a worse team than me because I now have more weeks to kind of assert my dominance.
Yeah.
So I think it just depends. It depends on your league, but I do think it's got to go to a vote with your leagues. I mean, and we'll see. We don't even know how the NFL players and teams are going to treat this. They may shut players down the last 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. If the teams are in the playoffs, they may shut them down for 2 weeks. So to be determined.
One more non-football question. It seems like all of them have been just immediately gone into fantasy anyway. If you could interview one person for your podcast, and this doesn't necessarily have to be a fantasy football person, but just any person that you would like to have a conversation with, and this could be all-time, dead or alive, anyone you'd ever like to strike that conversation with, who would it be?
Man, I saw this question on the show sheet. And I knew I skipped over it when we were looking at the show sheet because I didn't have a specific answer to it. I think I would probably pick somebody that maybe was a misunderstood personality. Probably somebody that's been passed away, just because it would be a little more prestigious to be able to interview somebody that isn't here anymore because there's only going to be so much that's already out there. But it'd probably be I have a fascination with world history, and I'm big into history. So it'd probably be somebody. I'm trying to think of a good example because there's so many different, scandals and things that have happened in history that I'd like to get to the bottom of. I will say this. Okay, so this is going to be probably a pretty controversial one. I would say between two people. I think interviewing probably Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be interesting, just because of the change that happened in the world at the time when he was the president, and just the number of people that he probably crossed paths with from so many different, government regimes and stuff like that. So I think he would be probably someone really fascinating to interview. And then from a sports figure wise, I think it would be probably pretty interesting to interview. I'm a Kentucky fan. I think it'd be real interesting to interview Adolph Rupp because there's a lot that's out there about him, about things that he believed in, things that he said that I don't think really anybody knows. It's just all hearsay, and it's been passed down through books and through literature. So that'd be somebody that I'd definitely want to get on the record kind of with what's going on, in the current landscape of, the country. I'd like to just get his take. So those are the two names that come to mind.
All right. Real interesting. As I was really curious. I'm always curious to everything you're going to say, but yeah, certainly. So
who would yours be? I know I'm taking over the host. Who would yours be?
I was wondering how many people would actually re-ask questions to me. I remember J Mike had he did this quite a bit, turning the questions back on me, and he mentioned Martin Luther King. I think someone wise. You mentioned turning point of history. I think I would also lean towards someone from the past. So my favorite musical composition piece, song, track, whatever, is it's a piece by French composer Claude Debussy. Claude Debussy is I could say it in the Anglicized way. So it'd probably be him. And his philosophy regarding music was very interesting. Not as much formal structure to his compositions that was quite prevalent at the time, and he really went free flowing, different types of chords, not resolving his cadences in what would be considered conventional ways, and he would almost eschew that. Like, I'm not trying to make things ethereal. I'm just trying to make music, and so I think I'd really like to have him kind of explain his process on composition, and specifically for that piece, La Mer, the sea in English. So yeah, I think Claude Debussy would be my answer.
Interesting, very interesting. I'm glad I asked you that one.
So for context, he was prevalent late 1800s. I believe he died early 19. I think he actually died during World War I. So a lot of his music, early 1900s, right at the turn of the century, right? And he saw a lot of when the world kind of became more aware of itself and bigger. My Monday night co-host, Gladys Louise Tyler, for both historical females, you would. So I guess she wants us to know for us historical females. I'm probably defaulting back to music as well with that. So you can go at any point too. I just trying to run quickly through my head. Female, what I like to interview.
I'm brainstorming on that. That's definitely a really good one. I'll have to think about that one during the rest of the show. But Gladys, I will definitely come up with an answer for you. I got to think about it for a little bit.
She's gonna hold it to us.
Yep, I'll come up with one.
Gladys has the 2-point conversion, so a 2-point question here. Also on the Going for Two Live network, alternating every Monday with myself. So look for her show next Monday. I think one of my favorite novels is Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley, I think, would be a really interesting person to ask. I think just a writer as well, Margaret Atwood, someone who's kept thinking of past, but someone who's still alive. I think Margaret Atwood also, like some of the way her word choice, especially in some of the novels. I think The Handmaid's Tale, a lot of the turn of phrases she used, really interesting, and it was in my mind, like, how did she get from this to this and have it make sense to me? So I think actually that's probably who I would go. It actually would be Margaret Atwood if I had to decide. But you can think about that through the episode, Scott. We'll talk about more fantasy now. I guess Frankenstein's kind of a fantasy novel, so that's the transition there. But some specific questions more on some strategies. Well, specific, this is a strategy. So what are your thoughts on zero RB?
Yeah, it's crazy because if you'd have asked me this question a year ago, I probably would have pushed back at least from a redraft perspective, just because of what we saw in 2019. If you went zero RB in 2019, you probably struggled only because there was a really, I don't want to say historic, but it was a really good year for running backs, and it reverted the other way last year. Now it didn't necessarily. Part of the zero RB argument last year would have been, draft a bunch of receivers early on. And there were plenty of receivers that got hurt / didn't perform last year. But it really was the rise of the elite quarterbacks that separated themselves from everybody else. And then also the elite tight ends that did the same thing. So the positional advantage crew that, essentially said, hey, get that positional advantage at quarterback and tight end, and you can fill in the gaps at receiver and at running back, could have taken a victory lap. Right now, so I think I'm probably leaning more towards kind of zero RB approach in Dynasty. And that doesn't mean that I'm not into, a lot of the running backs that are currently making up, the top 20, 15 and ADP in terms of Dynasty. It doesn't mean I don't like those guys. But I think last year was the time to get them. I'm not a fan of buying running backs at their market price. I think if you do that, you're constantly just you're essentially chasing your own tail. It's because you're going to have to pay up. If you want to go buy even somebody like Antonio Gibson, or if you want to go buy, even a guy like, we'll throw out even like James Robinson, still somebody that's young, but you're going to milk in the price of the fact that he's only a second-year running back. So there's a level of what you're buying isn't necessarily, a difference-making spot on your team. You're paying for the fact that there's a scarcity at running backs, and we see it every year. It's starting to dwindle down even more and more. Every single year, the number of running backs we can trust goes down. Usage is being spread across more positions, not just receiver, but by running backs as well. So if you go out, if you want to buy, Cam Akers or DeAndre Swift or Antonio Gibson, like, it's going to cost you probably more than what you want to pay. And that's probably an anti-process move. So I've shifted a lot of my teams going towards, hey, if I have 3 of those running backs from last year, right? Say I have Dobbins, Swift, and Edwards-Helaire. I'm okay cashing 1 or 2 out and getting my advantage at other positions. Now, part of that process is very similar to what it was in 2020, is banking that the 2023 running back class is going to be another one of these feeder systems into the NFL where it can create 5, 6, 7 immediate starters, year 1 starters that are going to gain value by year 2, like we saw last year. 2017 did it. 2020 did it. 2023, I hope, will do it. So part of my process is I need to get 2023 picks before they become, the thing, and I think you got to do it now before we get to next summer, Because next summer it's going to be, oh my gosh, next year is going to be the running back class that's going to redefine the ADP like 2020. And I think the other part of it is, you've probably noticed it, there's kind of like an age cliff to where if you want to buy like Joe Mixon right now, or if you want to buy Aaron Jones right now, or if you want to buy Derrick Henry right now, they still cost you something. But there's that point where, very few people I think in leagues are selling Jonathan Taylor or Cam Akers or DeAndre Swift. I mean, basically it's like, yeah, I need the king's ransom to trade one of those guys. But they may sell you Aaron Jones. They may sell you even Alvin Kamara or Dalvin Cook. Like, you're going to probably have to still pay the market price, but I think they become more available as they get into year 4, year 5, year 6, because people start to doubt, hey, this player's not going to last on my roster forever, so I'm more willing to sell. So part of my plan is 0 RB. I'm definitely out on the 2021 running back class as a whole, probably from where they're going to have to be paid for in rookie drafts, which is going to lead into 2022. And I'm really high on 2023. So I think I'm going to be probably largely out of the 2022 running back class too. So where am I going to fill in the gaps? Finding deals, whether it's the Chris Carsons, Kenyon Drakes, Melvin Gordons, that level, or it's a tier up and it's the Joe Mixons, Aaron Jones, Austin Eckler. They're still going to probably cost you future firsts, but I can stomach paying a 2022 first and a throw-in receiver for one of those running backs if I really need it. Last-ditch effort, but that's going to lend towards my builds being more like a modified 0 RB. Hopefully I have an anchor running back that I can rely on, but I don't need 3 or 4. I'm ready to kind of kick the can down the road for 2023 and gain advantages at quarterback and tight end.
All right, that makes sense. I know the one thought is the talk with 0 RB is always late running back, right? That's the philosophy, regardless of what you do early, is to, guys like you mentioned the Melvin Gordon tier, and I guess to a certain point, even if we're talking dynasty, right? Like, at what point do the Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon? I wonder, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, does he come in as a kind of almost a value, thinking, I don't think it's quite what we saw with David Montgomery, but after a disappointing David Montgomery rookie season, he was going 5th, 6th round last year, and that was quite the value. I think that's the range of this modified 0 RB, is to find who's the player that disappointed. We know we're going to get the opportunities, because it is an opportunity game from a running back perspective, who's disappointed. So the perception's down, but the opportunities will remain. That's like the Venn diagram of that key spot, I think.
Yeah, and I think part of what you said is it's not just, kind of fading the early running backs. It is optimizing your roster construction too. I mean, part of the strategy has to be supplemented by, hey, if I can find myself getting one of these, RB2s for Dynasty, and I can do it at an economical price or a discount, I'm still okay doing that, especially on a team where I'm really weak at running back. I don't mind going out and paying a little bit less for a guy like Clyde Edwards-Helaire versus having to pay the price for J.K. Dobbins or DeAndre Swift. I mean, I don't see I just did the patron show the other day. I mean, if you really look at, barring that there's a massive change in the way that these players are used, if you really look at a guy like J.K. Dobbins compared to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, their range of outcomes are not that different. And I think their range of outcomes speaks to the fact that a guy like Dobbins is probably overvalued. He's RB7, RB8 right now on the market. And, it takes a certain threshold to get to that range in terms of yearly production. And he doesn't check either box. Doesn't mean he's not good, but it might be just a product of the way they run their backfield, the number of plays that they run. He's going to get some touchdowns taken away by Lamar Jackson. So I just think there's pivot opportunities as well as some deals to be had. But, those names I mentioned, Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon, Ezekiel Elliott, I think those 3 guys have the same range of outcomes as Cam Akers, as Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb, J.K. Dobbins. But they come at a significant discount compared to those guys. And, you can apply that to your league or not. But I think there's some opportunities there to maybe buy those guys if you want. But you also supplement this by the fact I am collecting, especially right now before the NFL draft. If I'm doing a startup or if I can get them thrown into trades, I am collecting the anywhere from running back 30 to running back 70. You know what I mean? I'm collecting a dozen of those players. You're gonna trade me a mid-second for a receiver, throw in Darrell Henderson. You're gonna trade me, X, Y, or Z for X, Y, or Z. Throw in Phillip Lindsay. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's easier for me to say when I play in so many leagues, but I'm just taking shots. I want to go into the start of the season with, out of 30 roster spots, a dozen or more running backs that are an injury away or they are a game script away. And that's how I plan to get through the next couple seasons. It may work, it may not. But I think that's you can't go 0 RB and not flip your roster construction. You can't go 0 RB and then only carry 5 running backs. You're not giving yourself enough outs there. But I think you can make up for it, especially in deeper leagues.
I think one thing to say is this is quite a conversation on 0 RB is, it's all about pick the right players. I mean, 0 RB would have worked last year if you started Devontae Adams, Travis Kelce, but it wouldn't have worked if you started Michael Thomas, Chris Godwin. And I saw both types of builds done. And so, heavy RB, if you started Dalvin Cook, Aaron Jones, you were pretty happy. If you started Saquon Barkley, Joe Mixon, you weren't so happy. So at the end of the day, it's about the players. And again, it's not always, your first 2 picks don't make everything, but obviously they are important.
Yep.
So we'll get to that importance right now with all-time fantasy players. So Scott, who are your all-time fantasy QB1, RB1, wide receiver 1, and tight end 1?
Oh man, this is a tough one. So I'll give you my receiver because it's probably one of my favorite players. But I do remember, this was back when I kind of just picked the guys that I like. Remember, no process at this point. So Chad Ochocinco, one of my favorites. From a running back standpoint, man, that's a tough one because back in the day, go back, if anybody's interested, go back and look at the running back usage from like their 2000 to 2010. And just look at the ridiculous number of touches that some of the running backs would get. I mean, we would look at one of these players back then, like go back and look at the touches that somebody like Priest Holmes got and just compare that to like, what would he do? What would we do with a running back in today's NFL that's getting, 420 touches? Like we would treat that player like the 101 in any format, probably.
Yeah.
It's essentially like what Christian McCaffrey was a couple of years ago, plus 10%. And, there were a couple of them that would do that. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for that to be the case. So he's definitely one. Priest Holmes was one that I remember. I do remember I had Jamal Lewis in that year when he had 2,000 yards. That was another one that I remember. Tight ends. Tight ends are real tough. I don't even think I can pull a tight end out of nowhere. I know I used to have Jason Witten. I used to like drafting Jason Witten early on, but then kind of realizing that there was never really a ceiling with Jason Witten. He was never an elite tight end, but he was always pretty steady. And then quarterbacks, I can't even think of a quarterback off the top of my head just because I had no I'll just pass on the quarterbacks because I was never good at evaluating quarterbacks.
All right.
You supplement my question though. Do you have a quarterback?
I think all time, if you had to look at the fantasy numbers behind it, it'd be tough to ignore Peyton Manning, just the consistent high touchdown numbers, high yard numbers. But even like it almost feels like maybe too much recency bias. I don't think Aaron Rodgers is that far off either. And maybe that's my Packers bias as well in that. But I think just, the numbers that quarterbacks have been putting up, especially recently. And I think if he keeps going at this pace, 5-10 years from now, we'll say it's easily Patrick Mahomes, the all-time greatest fantasy quarterback. So it might even be that. And I mean, even to the tight end question, it might already be Kelce, just the sheer consistency he's had over the last half decade. What times we're in.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some quarterbacks back. I mean, everyone remembers playing, early Madden and Tecmo Bowl. There were definitely some quarterbacks back in the day that you kind of wish you would have been able to see in today's game. I remember I used to be a big hater on Michael Vick. I had one of my best friends was a Falcons fan, and he used to just tell me how great Michael Vick was. And I was so focused on, he can't pass, his completion percentage. And then, now I look through it as a Dynasty lens, and I'm like, I'd probably be one of the biggest Michael Vick fans if he was in Dynasty right now. He was 15 years ahead of his time. But if he was here right now, we'd be treating him like, because he wasn't a great passer, but he wasn't, he was adequate enough that he would have been able to last. Obviously, he was able to last in the league for a while. So, I mean, it's just interesting how the the eras totally change how you view players. Because I remember it used to be just saying, like, why is Michael Vick even a starter? He shouldn't be an NFL quarterback. Just born in the wrong era. So I think that's one that comes to mind.
Actually, just off that, Steve Young, right? That duo. Yep. I think Steve Young maybe presented a bit more like would present like the weekly upside of he could throw 5 touchdowns because he's throwing to Jerry Rice. So I think that's also maybe an interesting facet. I think probably shorter term of that high end consistency. But I mean, I think you mentioned that in a recent Dynasty and Chill episode. Would you rather have the consistency a couple years ago of Baker knowing, okay, yeah, he's going to be a top 15 quarterback for this, or would you want Lamar Jackson's going to be elite for 2-3 years and then eventually the end of his career not so great, but you get that league winning difference making in those 3 years, you'll take that all day.
Yep, for sure.
All right, so it's high time we're getting to the end of the episodes. This is the high fives. Top 5 in 5 different categories. So we'll start. I already revealed myself musically, but Scott, who are your top 5 artists or bands?
Man, so I went through this one and kind of just looked at. I am a country music fan. Kind of I wouldn't say an old school country music fan, but I'm definitely, I have my favorites. Was a big Eric Church fan before he even got big, so that's definitely one. Was a huge Rascal Flatts fan, so I'll put Rascal Flatts up there, even though I actually haven't listened to a lot of their recent music. But I'm always kind of partial to, some of their stuff from a decade ago. Brad Paisley was another one that really started. I was really a big fan of Brad Paisley when he first came out. Saw him in concert a couple times. A few others, I'll kind of go off the beaten path. I'm definitely I'll say I'm a Michael Jackson fan. A lot of his really early music I liked. And then obviously he has so many hits that, it's almost like you just can never not listen to them when they come on. That's one that kind of is just always stuck with me since I was a kid. And then the last one I would probably say the Eagles. I'm definitely a fan of the Eagles as well. So kind of a different range of music that I would say between those, but most of what I listen to is either country, and then I do have an affinity for doing karaoke, and we'll get on like I like singing. This is very, very, no one would have ever guessed this, but I love singing like boy band pop songs back from the 90s. So you'll catch me like once a year doing karaoke and singing some Backstreet Boys or 98 Degrees.
Do you have a go-to Backstreet Boys song?
Oh, man. So there's some video out there. No one that's ever listening to this will ever get to see it. But definitely sang some NSYNC back in high school. Some NSYNC songs. That was like kind of right during the prime of my high school and early college years. This I Promise You by NSYNC. There's a couple solo versions of me out there singing that. And then, I Want It That Way with Backstreet Boys is one of the best karaoke songs. So I'll put that one out there too, as I pretty much know every single word. So, yeah. All right. I didn't just say that, did I?
That's what we want. See, that's what you should have revealed in the thing no one knew about you earlier. But we got bonus there. So I'm actually partial to the new Backstreet Boys album, or newer Backstreet Boys album. They had a song called Breathe, and it's full a cappella. I think it's fantastic. So that would maybe be my new favorite for them. But yeah, definitely.
You got to give them credit too, man. They lasting power. They're going 20 plus years now. I mean, you got a round of applause for the Backstreet Boys. And
I mean, chemistry. I mean, 5 original members, like that. That can't be understated either. You barely see that with any forms of groups at all. No. Let alone just pop artists, rock bands. I mean, ZZ Top, the trio, how long they went, just the 3 of them. That's really the massive exception.
Yep.
All right. So that was a good discussion on artists and bands. How about your top 5 books?
All right. So top 5 books. So anybody that's ever, obviously I kind of gave a little bit of insight to it. But if anyone's heard of Tim Ferriss, any of Tim Ferriss's books, he has the 4-Hour Body, 4-Hour Work Week, the 4-Hour Chef. All of those are good, especially the 4-Hour Work Week and the 4-Hour Body. They're a little bit older, but just some very basic life principles that I still adhere to this day. So those 3 I would definitely put up there. 2 others. So there's a fascinating book. Anybody that's into science, there's a fascinating book called The Story of the Human Body. It talks about evolution of not only like disease and different, health conditions and nutrition, but it kind of touches on a lot of evolution and why we maybe think the way that we do, or why our bodies react the way that they do. And it's kind of fascinating to look at how you can apply some of that stuff to, maybe not the world we live in today, because it's totally different than, it was back when they're referring to, when the book was written. And it's not that the book was written back then, but what the era that they're talking about. But you can apply it to, you can kind of think, and once I read it, the reason I listed this was it changes how I look at things. I'll make a decision, or I'll look back at something that I did and said, you know what, there's some biology behind why I did that. And it may not even be anything that you would be able to see, but it can explain, some of the biology that happens and some of the ways that your brains work. So I put that one down. Oh man, a fifth one. So I'm trying to think of the title, but it's a book about behavioral economics. And I think it's just a basic, I have to look up the title, but I read it like 2 years ago, and it really helped me improve a lot in Dynasty, honestly, because it goes into, I have a math background and I have an accounting background, but a lot of numbers. But then to be able to mix it with making those decisions, why do people make financial decisions that they do? Why are people willing to do X, Y, and Z with their money? Or why are they willing to buy this? Or why are they willing not to do this? And it goes into the psychology of people making financial decisions. It's almost like the idea of like, I'll give you $1 today, or I'll give you, $2 tomorrow. Which one are you going to take? Like the time value of money and why people decide what they decide, or why people behave how they behave. And then it kind of applies to Dynasty. It's like, why is somebody acting this way when you propose a trade? Or, why are they thinking this way? What's the scope that they're thinking through? So that kind of changed the way that I played Dynasty too, because everything to me comes down to there's a value attached to every decision you make in life. And it's just about weighing, and sometimes you give up value when you make decisions. You say, hey, I'm giving up future value of X, Y, and Z because I want it right now. I want to fulfill whatever it is right now. So I think that changed the way that I think in a lot of ways in just everyday decisions.
Basically, those strike me as 5 process books almost.
Pretty much, yeah, exactly.
So we'll let people process that and move on to the top 5 movies.
All right, so top 5 movies. I'm going to go kind of hokey here, but then also interesting. I said I liked history. The original National Treasure with that's my favorite movie. The original National Treasure. So I'll just throw that out there. And other ones, Rookie of the Year. If anyone remembers Rookie of the Year, the baseball movie, that's one I probably have watched 500 times and can recite pretty much every line from it. So Rookie of the Year, I definitely put up there. Inception, a very deep, but that something that makes you think. You leave with like 50 more questions than you went into it with. So definitely that movie made me think. Is another one. Random movie that I really used to like, and I watched probably. I'm going back to movies I've watched tons of times. Do you remember the movie Runaway Jury?
No.
Okay, Runaway Jury. Check it out. It's
okay.
If I probably watched it, I haven't watched it in probably 5 years, but if I watched it now, I'd probably say, that really wasn't that great. But it's just one that I watched so many times when I was younger. Definitely that one. And then fifth one. Those are the ones that I came to my mind right away. AI, artificial intelligence. I think that one was a little bit before its time.
Yeah.
A lot of it applies. Yeah, John Cusack, Gladys. Shout out John Cusack and Runaway Jury.
Yeah, Gladys always has us covered.
She was on it. It is good.
So, yeah, she says it's great. So, yeah. So I guess, yeah, good. Yeah, I love Inception. I think National Treasure is probably my favorite Nicolas Cage movie. So I'm with you on that one.
A lot of cheesy ones, but yeah, it's good. It's good.
I mean, cheese. Maybe there's a lot of cheese involved in this. Top 5 game day foods. You're getting good at the transition.
Top 5 game day foods. So yeah. I am, ever since I told you I read the 4 Hour Body, I have basically adopted a keto/paleo type of diet. I am a very, very minimal processed sugar, carbohydrate consumer. So pretty much anything that fits under that. So wings are good. I eat a lot of ground beef. People think it's really, really boring. but I probably eat 3 or 4 pounds of ground beef a day. So I'll have to, that's why I started that Patreon channel, man. I gotta fund that grass-fed ground beef habit that I have. So that's ground beef. My favorite food in the entire world, this is probably really strange to people, is Brussels sprouts. So anything that you can flavor Brussels sprouts with is perfect. Bacon is great, so I'd put bacon as the number 4. The number 5, I'll go with macadamia nuts. They're a luxury. They're expensive. I don't get them all the time because you can literally eat an entire $20 container in like a day. But macadamia nuts, if I'm really splurging for a big fantasy weekend, macadamia nuts.
Big fantasy. And we revert back to fantasy for this last high five. What are the worst fantasy football rules or settings? So it's really a bottom 5 more than top 5. But
yeah. So I'm going to pare this down. The first thing is I don't like anything that creates constraints. So I think this is probably multiple answers, but if you're saying like, if you're in a startup draft and there's an auction, I don't want to be told how many players I have to leave the auction with, or I have to spend X amount per player. Like, I don't like constraints like that. I like freedom. I'm very much like, let me make the decisions on my own. Don't tell me the parameters. I mean, there has to be some parameters when it comes to leagues, but the more flexible, the better. So that's the first thing. Trade deadlines. I know that's a hot topic. I don't mind trade deadlines. I think with trade deadlines, you have to be very clear with what the intent is when you put a trade deadline in the league. I'm a fan of, if we have a trade deadline, it's literally the very last second possible. Like the last second before the first playoff game starts. So not 2 weeks before, a week before, but literally the very last second. And that still comes with, some flexibility to make a trade like on a Sunday, even if technically the week has locked already. So that's definitely what I'm not a fan of, is like early trade deadlines, week 11, week 10. Anyone that's in those leagues kind of knows it does kind of kill the activity. Once you get to that point, it kind of just slows down. So that's the second one. Just to make the other ones quick, I'm a fan of dynasty leagues that actually pay out a pretty hefty sum to the winner or the second place prize, or at least in lieu of a third place prize or a fourth place prize, you pay out the team that had the most points or the best record. I do think it's so hard to win a dynasty league with 12 or 14 teams. There's nothing worse than it's like, first place gets 40% of the pot. It's just, I'd like to, reward the person that finished on the top, whether that's luck or not. I'd like to reward, I like heftier payouts for the top. So I'd say that's a third. Oh man. Single quarterback. It should just be eliminated. That's the fourth. The fifth. All right, so here's one. I don't like when waiver wires lock for a long period of time. Again, back to that, I don't like constraints. I like waiver wires. My leagues, they just stay open once a week every single year, all year. Every week throughout the year, the waiver wire is open. No first come, first serve, but you're not locked into like a 4-month period where your roster's just stuck. So there you go. Those are the 5.
Awesome. And I guess the bonus question is Gladys's question. So historical female that you would like to interview.
All right. So a historical female. So I could only think of, I thought of 2. One, this came to mind just because, all of the stuff that happened like a month ago with the royal family. Like I'd love to interview like Princess Diana and just kind of get some insight into, imagine what we saw a month ago, but with the Princess Di interview. Like a tell-all of, and obviously you'd be able to find out exactly what happened, when she passed away, a lot of the secrets. I would think she had enough of a convicted personality that she might be one of the people that would, spill a lot of the information that probably we don't want to, people don't want going public. So she would be one. It's kind of speaking towards science. I did listen to a podcast with about Marie Curie a while back and some of her discoveries. She discovered a lot more than just, what we know her for, which obviously is, she's always tied to like the discovery of like the milk and the spoiling and stuff like that. But like there's so many other discoveries that she had that are worth looking into. So I think that would be a fascinating person to pick her brain in terms of just process. So I think she would be another one that I'd want to interview.
Yeah, because I mean that's turning point of the century. Again, we talk back to that. Like that's the establishment of what we know as science, the distinction of chemistry, physics, biology. Like that's she's kind of right there, right in those moments where all that's becoming established. So a lot
And
of
there
what
wasn't a lot of you're right, there wasn't a lot of like baseline knowledge to go off of. So it's, imagine creating something and you're really going out on a limb if you're wrong. You know what I mean? Like you have to be willing to take that risk, and probably a lot of people weren't willing to. So yeah, that'd be a good interview.
Yeah, all right. And Gladys says, "Nice, great show, guys. I agree. Great job, Scott. That was a great conversation, and I think I've given some good insight into your processes. There's a lot of process here. Well, hopefully everyone's processing that well. I'll stop making that joke. But this is a chance you have if you want to plug anything, your work, Twitter account, where people can find and follow you. Let them know."
Yeah, well, Kyle, thank you for having me on. Going for two, appreciate it. You're always enjoy chatting with you. Kyle is a member of the Chillbillies, so if you like Kyle's show, come and interact with him over there every once in a while as well. But yeah, I mean, it's nice to get away and talk some non-fantasy stuff. But you can find me at Charles Chill FFB on Twitter. The regular Dynasty and Chill podcast is on all podcast platforms. And then the Patreon channel. We talked about it a little bit. The Chillbillies, patreon.com/Dynasty and Chill. So if you kind of like mostly process and you'd say probably, at least in my group me list, it's always the one at the top. It's constantly just getting bumped to the very top. So yeah, if you like an active chat where you'll probably get a response on a question within 5 minutes or less all the time, then yeah, come join.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that and the Dynasty Trades HQ, those are the two that are always up there for me on my.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, both great patron chats with a lot of great people, and a lot of great things happening here at Going for Two, which you can follow on Twitter at Going for Two and at Going for Two Live for all the shows. I mean, one of our viewers, listeners, Gladys again has her show, The 2 Point Conversion, but I think we're up to about over a half dozen. I think we have 7 or 8 shows now. Of course, always Jeff Lambert's flagship armchair show is every Wednesday. Speak on It, I think every Tuesday for them. Most of the shows are going to be every 2 weeks, but Speak on It armchair every week, every Tuesday, Wednesday. So you can always look forward to them. For myself, I'm at Senra Says on Twitter. You could also follow my other podcast at FBC_Fantasy Pod, the Full Press Fantasy Pod. Yes, the name crossover here. That's thanks, Jeff. And once again, Manscaped. The 20% off code is PRESS, all caps, PRESS, and yeah, you get 20% off of all the great equipment courtesy of Manscaped. So definitely recommend everyone check that out. Check out again all the other great stuff on Going for Two. And again, Scott, thank you very much. I really appreciated this.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Good time.
All right. And we'll see you all in a couple weeks here